There are moments in history that freeze time. Moments when laughter turns to screams, when celebration is shattered by tragedy. Imagine it. Washington, D.C., spring of 1865. The Civil War has just ended. The streets are alive with music, fireworks, and cheers. Families embrace, soldiers march proudly, and for the first time in years, the air feels light. America is breathing again. At the center of it all stands one man, the tall, weary figure of President Abraham Lincoln. To the people, he is more than a leader. He is the healer of a broken nation, the man who ended slavery, the voice of hope after years of bloodshed. And on one April evening, Lincoln allows himself a rare gift, an evening of laughter at Ford's Theater. He doesn't know it will be his last, because somewhere in the shadows, a very different figure waits. John Wilkes Booth, charming, celebrated, adored on stage, nurtures a dark obsession. To him, Lincoln is not a savior, but a tyrant who destroyed the South. And in his twisted mind, destiny has chosen him to strike one final blow. What unfolds? That night is not just an assassination. It is the collision of two worlds, one of hope and one of hate. A single gunshot will silence a president, ignite the largest manhunt in American history, and forever alter the path of a nation. This is not the version found in textbooks. This is the untold story, the hidden details, the raw emotions, the chilling moments that history often leaves in the shadows. Tonight, we step inside Ford's Theater. Tonight, we relive the night America lost Abraham Lincoln. April the 14th, 1865. Washington, D.C. buzzed with a rare feeling of relief. For 4 long years, the Civil War had ripped the nation apart. Families had buried their sons, cities had burned, and the very soul of America had been tested. But now, at last, the war was over. Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox just 5 days earlier. The Union had triumphed. In the streets, crowds sang patriotic songs, bands played into the night, and fireworks lit up the dark sky. People were laughing again, embracing in celebration, believing the worst was finally behind them. At the heart of it all was President Abraham Lincoln. He carried the heavy scars of war, lines etched deep into his face, shoulders weighed down by the burden of leadership. But there was also a lightness about him that night. For the first time in years, Lincoln allowed himself to feel a moment of peace. He had spoken of healing, of reconciliation, of rebuilding a fractured nation with mercy instead of vengeance. His vision was not simply to end a war, but to unite a country that had been torn in two. That evening, Lincoln and his beloved wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, planned a simple night out. They had chosen Ford's Theater, a popular playhouse on 10th Street, to watch a comedy called Our American Cousin. It was light-hearted, silly, the kind of play that made people laugh, and Lincoln, so often consumed by sorrow, was eager to enjoy an evening of escape. The president needed laughter as much as the people did. With him that night were Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. It was to be a double date of sorts, an evening of joy at the end of one of the darkest chapters in American history. As the presidential carriage rolled through the streets toward Ford's Theater, crowds gathered to cheer. Men tipped their hats, women waved handkerchiefs, children called out to their hero. Lincoln leaned forward, smiling and acknowledging them with that familiar warmth. To the people, he was not just the president. He was the man who had saved the Union, the leader who had ended slavery, the father figure who had guided them through unimaginable loss. And though his weary frame showed the toll of battle and politics, his spirit that night seemed lighter, almost hopeful. Inside the theater, anticipation filled the air. The smell of oil lamps and perfume lingered. The chatter of well-dressed men and women echoed across the auditorium as they settled into their seats. This was no ordinary night. The word had spread quickly. The President of the United States would be attending. For the people of Washington, seeing Lincoln in person was a chance to witness living history. to be in the presence of the man who had steered the ship of state through the storm. At around 8:30 p.m., the play began. The actors took the stage, and laughter soon followed. The humor was exaggerated, the accents comical, the story a parody of cultural clashes between Americans and the British. Every joke landed with ease in the room filled with joy-starved citizens. And then, just after 9 p.m., the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. The President and First Lady had arrived. Lincoln and Mary were escorted to the presidential box, a decorated balcony draped with flags overlooking the stage. As the audience realized who had entered, the performance halted briefly. Everyone stood, clapping, cheering, saluting their president. The orchestra struck up, "Hail to the Chief." Lincoln bowed slightly, smiling, acknowledging the waves of adoration. Mary sat beside him, radiant in her gown, leaning close to her husband as the play resumed. In that moment, the theater felt more like a family gathering than a political stage. Laughter echoing, joy radiating, the nation united in celebration. But somewhere in the shadows of that same theater, another figure was present. Unseen by most, unnoticed amid the excitement, John Wilkes Booth, one of the most famous actors of his time, was waiting. He was handsome, charismatic, a man adored by theater audiences across the country. On any other night, his presence would have been celebrated. But not tonight. Tonight, Booth was not an entertainer. He was an assassin. Booth had slipped into the theater with ease. After all, he knew it well. The stagehands, the hallways, the trapdoors, the staircases, this was his world. Few would question his presence. In his pocket was a single-shot Derringer, pistol and a long knife, silent instruments of death. His plan was bold, reckless, and born of twisted conviction. The Confederacy had fallen, but Booth believed that by striking down Lincoln, he could revive its cause. In his delusion, this act would make him a hero. As the play continued, Lincoln leaned back in his chair, occasionally laughing at the exaggerated humor of the actors. For once, he allowed himself to forget about politics, about war, about the countless burdens that haunted his mind. The laughter in the theater lifted him, if only briefly, from the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. Mary leaned closer, whispering in his ear, her face glowing in the soft theater light. They looked, in that moment, like any other couple sharing an evening together. Yet outside that small box, danger crept closer. Booth was moving quietly through the theater, each step calculated, each breath steady. He knew the lines of the play by heart, knew the exact moments when laughter would erupt loud enough to mask the sound of his pistol. He was waiting for that one perfect instant when the audience's joy would cover the crack of a gunshot. And so the stage was set. A weary president finding solace in a night of laughter, a city celebrating its rebirth, and a famous actor lurking in the shadows with murder in his heart. The crowd had no idea they were not just watching a comedy. They were living through the opening act of a tragedy that would shock the world. John Wilkes Booth was not just any man wandering into Ford's Theater that night. He was a star, a celebrated actor, someone who had performed on that very stage and been adored by audiences across America. In the 1860s, the Booth family name was as famous as any in Hollywood today. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, had been a legendary actor. His brothers Edwin and Junius Jr. also acclaimed on the stage. But John, he was different. He was handsome, magnetic, a man who commanded attention not only with his voice but with his presence. To many, he was the perfect leading man. Yet behind the charm and talent, there lived an obsession, a fire of hatred that burned hotter with every Union victory. Not over, it simply needed one final daring act. At first, Booth had not planned to kill Lincoln. Months earlier, his scheme had been different. He had conspired with others to kidnap the president, to seize him and deliver him to Richmond as a bargaining tool for the South. Booth had recruited men, David Herold, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and others, promising them glory and reward if they succeeded. But as Confederate hopes collapsed, the kidnapping plan faded into futility. Lee had surrendered. Richmond had fallen. The Confederacy was dead. For Booth, the humiliation was unbearable. If the South could not rise again in the battlefield, then perhaps it could rise through martyrdom, through vengeance, through a single blow that would shock the Union to its core. The idea took root in his mind. Kill Lincoln, and not just Lincoln. Kill the top leaders of the Union in one night: Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William H. Seward, and the President himself. Strike at the very heart of the government. Decapitate the Union leadership in a coordinated attack. In Booth's twisted imagination, this would be the act that avenged the South, that threw the Union into chaos, that gave the Confederacy a chance to breathe again. He believed history would remember him as a hero. Booth prepared meticulously. He knew the theater, knew the president's habits, knew that Lincoln often visited public places with minimal protection. In those days, the concept of presidential security was almost non-existent. Lincoln himself disliked being surrounded by guards. He wanted to appear approachable, one of the people. It was this accessibility that made him beloved and vulnerable. Booth studied the theater, memorized the entrances, the staircases, the doors leading to the presidential box. He had the advantage of being a familiar face. No one would question his presence backstage. To the theater staff, he was not a stranger. With ill intent, he was John Wilkes Booth, the actor, the celebrity. On the morning of April 14th, Booth learned that Lincoln would be attending Ford's Theater that night. The news was in the papers. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the moment to execute his plan. He gathered his conspirators and laid out their assignments. Lewis Powell would attack Secretary of State Seward at his home, stabbing him in his bed. George Atzerodt was to assassinate Vice President Johnson in his hotel. Booth himself would take on Lincoln, the ultimate prize. 3 murders, 1 night, a nation thrown into panic. But as Booth looked around at his co-conspirators, the cracks were already showing. Atzerodt was hesitant, fearful, a man with little stomach for violence. Powell was reckless but loyal. Herold, the young accomplice, would serve as Booth's guide in the escape. Booth, however, remained the mastermind, the driving force. He spoke with fiery conviction, insisting this was not murder, but justice. To him, Lincoln's death was not a crime, it was destiny. That afternoon, Booth prepared for his role not on the stage, but in history's darkest drama. He polished his pistol, a small derringer, easy to conceal but deadly at close range. He carried a knife, sharp and strong, meant for defense if anyone tried to stop him. He rehearsed the moment in his mind. Enter quietly, wait for the perfect line in the play, fire the shot, leap to the stage, and escape into the night on horseback. It was bold. It was theatrical. It was something only an actor like Booth could envision, and Booth loved the idea of spectacle. To him, this was more than an assassination. It was a performance. He imagined the audience in shock, the nation in disbelief, his name echoing through history as the man who dared to do what others would not. He even prepared a dramatic line to shout as he leapt from the box, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. The very motto of Virginia, a cry of rebellion, a declaration that Lincoln was no better than Caesar, struck down for his tyranny. Booth was not simply killing a man. He was playing a role, one he believed would immortalize him. But behind the bravado, there was fear. Booth knew once the deed was done, there would be no going back. He would be hunted, reviled, by millions, forced into the shadows. Yet he convinced himself that martyrdom was worth it. Better to die for the South than live in a Union-controlled world where everything he believed in had crumbled. As evening approached, Booth made his final preparations. He checked his watch, adjusted his clothing, and rode through the streets of Washington unnoticed. Around him, the city was alive with celebration. Gas lamps glowed, people sang patriotic songs, soldiers paraded through the streets. Booth alone carried a different energy. Where others saw victory, he saw betrayal. Where others felt joy, he felt rage. By the time the play was underway at Ford's Theatre, Booth was already moving. He visited the tavern next door where he had left his horse in the care of a stable boy. He drank, perhaps to calm his nerves, perhaps to steady his shaking hands. Then, slipping into the theatre, he blended with the crowd. He knew his way backstage, he knew the corridors, and most importantly, he knew that Lincoln was sitting just feet away in the presidential box, laughing at the play, unaware that death was stalking him in the shadows. Every step Booth took that night was deliberate. Every breath carried the weight of history. The theater was his stage, the pistol his prop, and the president his final audience. What Booth did not know was that though he believed he was about to become a hero of the South, the world would remember him as something very different. And so, with his plan in motion, Booth made his way closer, the theater alive with laughter, the flags draped over the presidential box, the crowd oblivious to the darkness that was about to descend. The moment of truth was coming, and Booth was ready to deliver the performance that would end Abraham Lincoln's life and shock the world forever. The theater was alive with laughter, but inside John Wilkes Booth, there was only silence. He moved, with the confidence of a man who belonged, slipping past doors and hallways that others would never dare to enter. To Booth, this building was a second home, and that night, it had become the stage for his darkest performance. The play carried on, the crowd lost in the humor of Our American Cousin, but Booth's focus was locked on the box draped in flags, where Abraham Lincoln sat, unaware that his life was ticking down to its final moments. The presidential box was guarded by a single man, John Parker, a policeman who had been assigned to protect the president. But Parker was not at his post. He had wandered, distracted, perhaps even slipped across the street for a drink. The doorway to Lincoln's box, the last barrier between the president and danger, was unguarded. Fate, it seemed, had opened the path for Booth. Booth approached the door quietly, steadying his breath, clutching his small Derringer pistol in one hand and the knife tucked securely at his side. He peered through a small hole he had earlier carved in the door, confirming the president was there, seated comfortably beside Mary Todd Lincoln, with Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris beside them. Lincoln leaned back in his chair, his tall frame relaxed, his eyes on the stage. For once he was free of worry, free of burden. In the glow of the theater lights, he was simply a man enjoying an evening out with his wife. On stage, the comedy moved into its third act. The actors traded lines. The audience roared with laughter. Booth waited, timing everything with precision. He knew the script. He knew when the laughter would be loudest. He needed that perfect cover, the moment when sound would mask the crack of the pistol. The line approached, the famous punchline that always brought the house down. His pulse quickened. His chance was seconds away. Asa Trenchard, the character on stage, delivered the line, "You sockdologizing old man trap!" The audience erupted. Laughter filled every corner of the theater. In that instant, Booth pushed open the door, stepped inside the box, and raised his pistol. The shot rang out. A single, deafening crack shattered the laughter. Lincoln's head jerked forward as the bullet struck just behind his left ear, tearing through bone and brain before lodging behind his right eye. His body slumped, his long frame collapsing forward as Mary screamed. The theater froze in confusion. For a split second, the audience thought it might have been part of the play, some strange sound effect. But the horror in the presidential box made it clear. This was no act. Major Henry Rathbone, startled and horrified, lunged at Booth. But Booth was prepared. He dropped the pistol, pulled out his knife, and slashed wildly. The blade tore into Rathbone's arm, cutting deep, blood spilling across the walls of the box. Rathbone stumbled back, wounded but alive, as Booth turned toward the railing. The assassin's plan demanded drama, and drama he would deliver. With the knife still in hand, Booth leapt over the edge of the box, falling nearly 12 feet. To the stage below. His spur caught in the American flag draped across the balcony, and he landed awkwardly, crashing hard onto the boards. His leg snapped under the impact. Some say it was his fibula, shattered in the fall. The pain was searing, but Booth's adrenaline carried him. Rising on the stage, knife raised, he shouted the words he had rehearsed, the words he believed would echo through history. Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Some witnesses swore he added, "The South is avenged." The audience gasped, chaos erupting as people realized what had happened. Women screamed, men shouted, soldiers in the crowd reached for weapons. On stage, actors stood frozen, unsure if this was madness or reality. Booth brandished his knife, his face wild with rage, before turning and running across the stage, disappearing into the wings. The theater exploded into pandemonium. In the presidential box, the scene was one of shock and despair. Mary Todd Lincoln clutched her husband, screaming for help. Clara Harris tried to comfort her, blood from Rathbone's wound staining her gown. Rathbone, though bleeding heavily, called desperately for doctors. Lincoln's head had fallen forward, his breathing shallow, his body limp. The bullet had done its work instantly. There was no coming back. Doctors in the audience rushed forward, climbing into the box, examining the president where he sat slumped in his chair. They tried to revive him, but quickly realized the wound was fatal. The bullet had pierced the brain. Lincoln was alive, but just barely, his breath shallow, his pulse weak. The decision was made to carry him out of the theater, across the street to a boarding house where he might rest more comfortably. Meanwhile, Booth, limping from his broken leg, forced his way through the backstage door and out into the alley, where his horse waited. The stable boy held the reins, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded inside. Booth mounted clumsily, wincing from the pain, but spurred the horse into the night. His escape had begun. Behind him, Washington was about to descend into chaos. Inside Ford's Theater, the audience spilled into the aisles, panic spreading like fire. Some shouted that the Confederates were attacking. Others cried that the entire government was under siege. Rumors spread instantly, fear gripping the crowd. The play was forgotten, the laughter was gone. The theater had become a scene of blood and tragedy. Back in the box, Mary Todd Lincoln wept uncontrollably, clutching her husband's hand, begging him to stay with her. The soldiers cleared the way as Lincoln's body was lifted carefully, carried through the theater and across the street to the Peterson house. There, doctors worked through the night, but hope was fleeting. The President of the United States had been struck down in front of his people at the very moment they had believed peace had finally returned. What John Wilkes Booth had done in seconds would ripple through history for centuries. The laughter of that night was silenced forever, replaced by grief, shock, and rage. America had watched its leader fall, not on the battlefield, but in the very heart of its capital. In a place of joy and light turned instantly into a chamber of darkness. The shot that shook the theater had also shaken the soul of the nation. The unthinkable had happened. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had preserved the Union, was dying. And John Wilkes Booth, broken leg and all, was riding into the shadows, believing he had just delivered a blow that would make him a legend. But Booth was wrong. His name would live on, yes, but not as a hero, not as a savior. His name would live in infamy, forever bound to that single shot, that single moment when laughter turned to screams, when history itself seemed to hold its breath, and when the United States lost the man who had carried it through its greatest trial. The gunshot that echoed through Ford's Theater had shattered more than a president's skull. It had broken the heart of a nation. As Abraham Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson house, still clinging faintly to life, John Wilkes Booth was galloping into the darkness of Washington. He believed he had just struck the greatest blow for the South, an act that would turn him into a hero. But what lay ahead was not glory. It was 12 days of fear, pain, betrayal, and a desperate attempt to outrun justice. Booth's leg throbbed, in agony as his horse pounded down the alley. The fall from the balcony had left him crippled, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Every hoofbeat echoed like a drum of defiance. He knew the city would soon erupt in panic, and soldiers would scour every corner for him. But Booth was certain he had history on his side. In his fractured mind, he was Brutus striking down Caesar, a savior of liberty. His first stop was a rendezvous just outside the city, where he met his accomplice, David Herold. Together they fled south into Maryland, seeking shelter in sympathetic homes. Booth's injury worsened with every mile, his broken leg swelling and blackening. At one farmhouse, he persuaded a doctor named Samuel Mudd to treat him. Mudd splinted the leg and gave Booth a place to rest. History would forever brand Dr. Mudd's name with controversy. Was he a willing conspirator, or simply a man trapped into aiding a desperate fugitive? As Booth limped deeper into the countryside, Washington spiraled into chaos. Soldiers patrolled the streets, arresting dozens suspected of Confederate sympathies. Telegraph wires carried the shocking news across the country. The president had been shot. People wept openly in the streets. Flags were draped in black. In city after city, bells tolled in mourning. Lincoln's breathing grew weaker with every passing hour until at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, he took his final breath. At his bedside, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is said to have whispered the immortal words, "Now he belongs to the ages." The United States was stunned. At the very moment of its rebirth from the ashes of war, the nation was thrust into despair. Church bells rang across the North. Entire towns draped themselves in black. The man who had freed the enslaved, preserved the Union, and envisioned a future of reconciliation was gone. And as grief spread, so too did fury. The name John Wilkes Booth became a curse on every tongue. The largest manhunt in American history was launched. Soldiers scoured the countryside, thousands strong, chasing rumors and shadows. Booth and Herold crept from barn to barn, swamp to swamp, always one step ahead of their pursuers. By day, they hid. By night, they rode. Booth, ever the actor, scribbled in his journal by candlelight, convinced the world would one day see him as a martyr. "I struck down a tyrant," he wrote, blind to the truth that history had already cast him as a villain. Days stretched into nights, and the net closed tighter. Booth's leg was infected, his body weakening, his spirit fraying. Farmers turned him away, soldiers closed in, and whispers of his presence reached Union patrols. On April 26th, nearly 2 weeks after the assassination, Booth and Herold found themselves cornered at a tobacco farm in Virginia, the Garrett Farm. It was just before dawn when Union soldiers surrounded the barn where Booth was hiding. They demanded his surrender. Herold, terrified, gave himself up immediately. But Booth refused. He shouted defiantly that he would never be taken alive. His voice, once commanding on stage, now trembled with desperation. The soldiers set the barn ablaze, flames, crackling, smoke choking the air. Inside, Booth stumbled, his crippled leg failing him. He raised his pistol, vowing to fight to the end. Then a shot rang out, not from Booth's gun, but from a Union soldier's. The bullet pierced Booth's neck, shattering his spine. He collapsed onto the barn floor, paralyzed, his body consumed by pain and firelight. As the soldiers dragged him from the flames, Booth whispered faintly, "Tell my mother I died for my country." Moments later, he asked someone to lift his hands. He looked at them, the hands that had once held roses from adoring fans, the hands that had fired the fatal shot into Lincoln's skull, and said his final words, "Useless, useless." With that, John Wilkes Booth breathed his last. The man who sought glory found only disgrace. Back in Washington, the mourning for Lincoln swelled into an ocean of grief. His body was carried in a funeral train across the nation, from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. Millions lined the tracks, standing in silence as the train passed, their tears falling like rain. Farmers, widows, freedmen, and soldiers, people from every walk of life, came to pay their respects. They saw not just a president, but a symbol of sacrifice, a man who had given everything to hold the Union together. Lincoln's assassination was more than the death of a leader. It was the theft of a vision. He had dreamed of binding the nation's wounds with malice toward none, with charity for all. Without him, the path of Reconstruction would become darker, harsher, and far more divided. Booth believed he had struck a blow for the South, but in truth, he dealt the Confederacy its final wound. Instead of weakening the Union, his bullet united the North in rage and cemented Lincoln's legacy as a martyr for freedom. History would never remember Booth as the savior he imagined. His name became a byword for betrayal, his life reduced to a cautionary tale. Lincoln, however, was immortalized. Statues rose, words were etched into stone, and generations to come would look upon his memory with reverence. Even in death, Lincoln's influence grew. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not just a moment in time, it was a turning point. It reminded the world that freedom has a cost, that leadership demands sacrifice, and that even the greatest of men can be cut down in an instant. But it also showed that an idea, once born, cannot be killed. Lincoln's dream of a united America endured, carried forward by those who believed in his vision. The echoes of that night in Ford's Theater still reach us today. The laughter that turned to screams, the shot that changed a nation, the fugitive who found no glory, and the president who found eternity. It is a story that reminds us of the fragility of life and the weight of legacy. And if this story has moved you, if it has made you feel the tragedy, the suspense, and the history that shaped a nation, then I invite you to keep this journey alive. Like this video, share it with others who love history, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss more untold stories from the past. Together, we'll keep history alive, one story at a time.